September 26, 1918, dawned cold and misty over the Argonne Forest in northeastern France, where 26,000 young American soldiers crouched in muddy trenches, their hands trembling not from the autumn chill, but from the knowledge that in mere hours it would charge into the largest battle their nation had ever fought. Private Thomas James Richardson, barely 19 years old, clutched his Springfield rifle and thought of his mother's kitchen in Ohio, never imagining that this dense, fog-shrouded forest would become a graveyard for his generation. The Great War had raged across Europe for 4 devastating years before America entered the conflict in April 1917. Now, 17 months later, General John Joseph Pershing commanded over 1 million American soldiers in France, determined to prove that these fresh-faced doughboys could match the battle-hardened veterans of Britain, France, and Germany. The Meuse-Argonne offensive would be their test by fire. None of them, neither the generals planning in their headquarters nor the privates shivering in their trenches, fully comprehended the horror that awaited. According to military records preserved in the National Archives and detailed in the AEF in the First World War published by the U.S. Army, the Center of Military History, the offensive involved more than 1.2 million American troops across a front stretching 24 miles, making it the largest military operation in United States history up to that point. The artillery barrage began at 2:30 in the morning, transforming the peaceful French countryside into a hellscape of fire and thunder. Over 4,000 American guns unleashed their fury upon German positions, the sound so tremendous that soldiers 3 miles behind the lines pressed their hands against their ears in pain. Private Richardson watched the horizon light up like a deadly sunrise, each flash illuminating the terrified faces of his comrades. At 5:30, whistles blew along the American lines. Officers shouted commands that were barely audible over the continuing bombardment. Richardson climbed out of his trench alongside thousands of others, their boots squelching in mud mixed with the blood of earlier skirmishes. The fog was so thick that soldiers could barely see 10 feet ahead, which proved both blessing and curse, hid them from German machine gunners, but it also meant they quickly lost contact with their units. The German defenders, members of the battle-tested Fifth Army, had spent years fortifying this region. They had constructed elaborate trench systems, bunkers reinforced with concrete and steel, positioned machine gun nests with overlapping fields of fire. The terrain itself favored defense: dense forest, steep ravines, and hills that provided perfect observation points. The Americans were attacking directly into prepared defenses held by experienced soldiers who knew every tree and fold in the ground. Within the first hour, the offensive began to unravel. Fog that had provided initial cover now caused catastrophic confusion. Units became separated, wandered into wrong sectors, and stumbled into murderous crossfires. Richardson's company advanced barely half a mile before German machine guns opened up from concealed positions. Cutting down men like wheat before a scythe, he dove behind a fallen log as bullets chewed the bark above his head, listening to the screams of wounded soldiers calling for medics who could not reach them through the maelstrom. By midday on September 26th, the carefully planned offensive had degenerated into dozens of separate chaotic battles scattered across the Argonne Forest. Lieutenant Colonel William Henry Harrison, a 32-year-old officer from Virginia, struggled to maintain command of his battalion as runners sent with messages failed to return, and telephone lines were severed by German artillery. The fog had lifted, but now thick smoke from burning forests and exploding shells created an artificial twilight where friend and foe were difficult to distinguish. The American casualties mounted with shocking speed. Young men who had been joking nervously just hours before now lay dead or dying among the shattered trees. Medical corpsmen worked frantically, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded. Private Richardson, somehow still alive, had become separated from his unit and found himself attached to a group of soldiers from Pennsylvania. They had taken shelter in a shell crater, surrounded by the bodies of German soldiers killed in the initial bombardment. The German response was methodical and devastating. Their artillery, guided by observers positioned on high ground, pounded American positions with horrifying accuracy. Their machine gunners, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front against Russia, fired with disciplined economy, waiting for American soldiers to expose themselves before unleashing brief, lethal bursts. The landscape transformed into a nightmarish maze of barbed wire, shell craters, destroyed equipment, and human remains. General Pershing, at his headquarters, miles behind the lines, received fragmentary reports that painted an incomplete picture of the disaster unfolding in the forest. His staff officers marked maps with colored pins showing projected advances. But the reality on the ground bore no resemblance to these optimistic calculations. The American First Army had been ordered to advance 10 miles on the first day and break through the German defensive system. Instead, most units had advanced less than 2 miles and were now pinned down under heavy fire. The inadequate training of many American soldiers became brutally apparent. Unlike the British and French, who had learned hard lessons over 4 years of trench warfare, the Americans had mere months of preparation. Many soldiers had never thrown a live grenade before entering combat. Officers had limited experience commanding under fire. Communication systems broke down repeatedly. Supply lines, struggling to keep pace with the advance, failed to deliver ammunition, food, and medical supplies where they were desperately needed. As darkness fell on the first day, Richardson and his makeshift group tried to dig in for the night. The ground was hard, filled with roots and rocks, making entrenchment agonizingly slow. German artillery continued its harassment, random shells screaming down throughout the night, making sleep impossible. Men who closed their eyes saw the faces of friends killed that day. Those who had prayed before battle now prayed simply to survive until dawn. The night was filled with sounds that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The moans of wounded soldiers lying in no man's land, too far forward to be retrieved. Da, da. Harsh bark of German machine guns firing at movement. The whispered conversations of frightened soldiers wondering if they would see another sunset. Richardson wrote a brief letter to his mother by the light of shell bursts, though he had no idea how or when it might be sent. He told her he was well, a lie they both would have recognized. October 2, 1918 marked the beginning of an ordeal that would capture international attention and symbolize both the courage and the cost of America's commitment to the war. Major Charles White Whittlesey, a 33-year-old lawyer from New York who had been practicing law just a year earlier, led approximately 550 men from the 77th Division deep into the Argonne Forest. They were following orders to advance rapidly and maintain pressure on retreating German forces, orders based on faulty intelligence that dramatically underestimated enemy strength in the sector. Whittlesey was a thoughtful, bookish man who seemed ill-suited for military command. But he possessed a quiet determination that earned his soldiers respect. His units, drawn from the diverse neighborhoods of New York City, included recent immigrants who spoke halting English, sons of wealthy families, and working-class men from Brooklyn and the Bronx. They advanced through increasingly difficult terrain, thick undergrowth catching at their uniforms, steep hillsides requiring hands and knees climbing. By late afternoon, Whittlesey realized something was terribly wrong. His battalion had advanced far beyond supporting units on either flank. The promised reinforcements had not materialized. When he sent runners back to establish contact with headquarters, they did not return. German fire was increasing in intensity, coming now from 3 sides. His force occupied a small pocket on a hillside, approximately 300 yards long and 60 yards wide, surrounded by enemy positions. The situation deteriorated rapidly as German forces moved to encircle the isolated Americans completely. Machine gun fires swept the American position from multiple angles, making any movement suicidal. German snipers picked off soldiers who exposed themselves even briefly. By nightfall on October 2nd, Whittlesey's command was completely surrounded, cut off from supplies, reinforcements, and communication with higher headquarters. The ordeal of what newspapers would soon call the Lost Battalion had begun. The trapped soldiers began rationing their meager supplies immediately. They had advanced with only 2 days' rations, expecting resupply that would never come. Ammunition was distributed carefully, with orders to fire only when targets were clearly identified. Medical supplies were pitifully inadequate for the number of wounded. The battalion's medical officer, Captain Nelson Meyer Holderman, worked ceaselessly despite his own wounds, treating injuries with whatever materials were available. On October 3rd, the Germans launched their first major assault on the surrounded battalion. Attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, they attempted to overwhelm the American position through sheer numbers. Whittlesey's men, fighting desperately, repulsed the attack, but at tremendous cost. Dozens of Americans were killed or wounded in the fierce fighting. The small perimeter grew even smaller as the living pulled back to more defensible positions, forced to leave their dead where they fell. The psychological pressure on the trapped soldiers was immense. They could hear German voices all around them, calling out in English, sometimes taunting them, sometimes attempting to persuade them to surrender. The sounds of battle from other sectors reached them, raising hopes that relief forces were approaching, only for those hopes to be dashed when the sounds faded or moved away. Thirst became a torment worse than hunger, as the only water source was a stream at the bottom of the ravine, fully exposed to German fire. Carrier pigeons, the primary communication method for isolated units, became the trapped battalion's only hope. Whittlesey composed brief messages describing his position and desperate situation, attaching them to the legs of the few pigeons they possessed. The birds were released one by one, flying up through the forest canopy with the prayers of 500 men following them into the sky. October 4th, 1918 brought fresh horror to the trapped soldiers when American artillery shells began falling on their position. The devastating irony was not lost on the men who had survived German attacks only to be killed by their own side's weapons. The shells crashed through the forest canopy, exploding among the huddled soldiers with terrifying randomness, sending deadly shrapnel in all directions. Whittlesey frantically composed another message for the carrier pigeons, but most of the birds had already been released or killed. Only one pigeon remained, a dark checker hen named Cher Ami, a name meaning dear friend in French. The pigeon had been donated to the U.S. Army Signal Corps by British pigeon fanciers and had already completed several missions successfully. Now, she represented the battalion's last hope to stop the friendly artillery fire that was decimating their ranks. The message Whittlesey attached to Cher Ami's leg was desperate and direct. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." As the pigeon was released, German soldiers immediately opened fire, recognizing the bird's significance. Cher Ami was hit, falling initially, but then rising again with extraordinary determination, flying through the hail of bullets toward American lines. The small bird, despite being shot through the breast, blinded in one eye, and having her right leg nearly severed, completed the 25-mile flight in just 25 minutes. The message dangled from the few remaining tendons of her mangled leg. Army medics later saved Cher Ami's life, and she became one of the most famous animals in military history, eventually receiving the French Croix de Guerre medal. Her flight saved the lives of countless trapped soldiers as the artillery barrage was immediately lifted. Back in the pocket, conditions continued to worsen. The wounded lay in makeshift aid stations, their groans filling the air day and night. Medical supplies had been exhausted, and doctors resorted to using strips torn from uniforms as bandages. Soldiers who had been shot multiple days earlier developed infections, their wounds festering in the damp, unsanitary conditions. Men dying of gangrene begged for morphine that no longer existed. Food had run out completely by October 4th. Soldiers chewed on leaves and bark, trying to quiet their growling stomachs. Some men, driven by desperation, crawled toward the stream under cover of darkness, attempting to reach water. Many were killed by German machine gunners who maintained constant vigilance over the water source. Those who succeeded in filling canteens often found the water contaminated with the bodies of soldiers who had died trying to reach it earlier. The German commanders recognized that time was their ally. Rather than waste soldiers in frontal assaults, they tightened their encirclement and waited for starvation and thirst to do their work. Periodically, they called out in English, offering food and medical care if the Americans would surrender. Whittlesey ignored these offers, though he could see the suffering of his men and knew each passing hour reduced their chances of survival. Communication runner Abraham Krotoshinsky, Jewish immigrant from Poland, who had been in America only a few years, volunteered for a desperate mission on the night of October 4th. He would attempt to slip through German lines to reach American headquarters with a detailed report of the battalion's situation. The 23-year-old barber from the Lower East Side of Manhattan crawled through the darkness, moving inches at a time, freezing whenever German voices came near. And his successful journey through enemy lines and back to American positions provided crucial intelligence that would guide relief efforts. October 7th, 1918 witnessed the American High Command launching a massive relief operation to save the surrounded battalion. The 77th Division, along with elements of the 28th Division, attacked German positions surrounding the pocket with unprecedented ferocity. The American commanders, embarrassed by the international publicity surrounding the trapped soldiers and determined to demonstrate American military capability, committed thousands of troops to the rescue effort. The relief force encountered the same deadly German defenses that had stopped earlier advances. Machine gun nests positioned in depth created killing zones through which American soldiers had to advance. German artillery, firing from positions carefully registered over weeks of preparation, dropped shells with devastating accuracy. The American casualties mounted rapidly, young men dying by the hundreds to save 500 trapped comrades. Corporal Alvin Kalim York, a 29-year-old farmer from Tennessee, participated in a flanking attack on October 8th that would make him America's most celebrated hero of the war. York, a former conscientious objector who had reconciled his religious beliefs with military service, led a small patrol that captured a German machine gun position. Using his exceptional marksmanship skills developed hunting turkeys in the Tennessee mountains, York picked off German soldiers with methodical precision. The action that would earn York the Medal of Honor unfolded rapidly. When German soldiers charged his position, York shot them down one by one, starting with the last man and working forward. Using the same technique he employed when hunting wild turkeys so that the flock wouldn't scatter, recognizing the hopelessness of their situation, a German officer eventually surrendered his entire unit. York and his 7 surviving patrol members marched 132 German prisoners back to American lines, having killed or captured an entire German battalion. Meanwhile, the trapped soldiers endured their 7th day of siege. Men were dying not just from wounds but from exposure, dehydration, and sheer exhaustion. Some soldiers had gone insane from the stress, sitting vacant-eyed and unresponsive. Others had developed a 1,000-yard stare, mechanically performing tasks while seeming emotionally absent. Whittlesey himself was gaunt and exhausted, but he continued moving among his men, offering quiet words of encouragement even when he privately doubted relief would arrive in time. The breakthrough came on the afternoon of October 7th, when elements of the 77th Division finally punched through German lines and made contact with the trapped battalion. The relief soldiers were shocked by what they found: skeletal figures in tattered, filthy uniforms, many too weak to stand. Of the approximately 550 men who had entered the pocket, fewer than 200 were able to walk out. The others were dead, too severely wounded to move, or so weakened by their ordeal that they required stretchers. The cost of the relief operation was staggering. The divisions involved in breaking through to the trapped battalions suffered over 3,000 casualties. When combined with the losses suffered by the trapped battalion itself, nearly 4,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded in this single episode of the larger Meuse-Argonne offensive. The numbers raised uncomfortable questions about whether the military glory was worth the human price. Private Richardson, who had somehow survived 3 weeks of continuous combat, was part of a reserve unit that entered the recaptured area after the relief. He walked through the small pocket where the battalion had made its stand, seeing the earthworks where desperate men had fought and died. The ground was littered with empty ration tins, discarded equipment, and hasty graves. The experience crystallized for him the fundamental truth that the generals and politicians rarely acknowledged. Battles were won not by grand strategy, but by the suffering and sacrifice of individual soldiers. October 15, 1918 found the American First Army still locked in brutal combat throughout the Meuse-Argonne sector. 3 weeks of continuous fighting had produced casualties that shocked even veteran commanders accustomed to the Great War's horrific arithmetic. The American forces had suffered over 100,000 casualties killed, wounded, missing, or captured in less than a month of fighting. The nature of the combat had evolved into a grinding war of attrition that negated American advantages in numbers and industrial capacity. Every ridge, every forest grove, every village became a separate battleground, where soldiers fought house to house and tree to tree. The German army, though weakening, maintained fierce resistance, understanding that every day they delayed the American advance was another day their negotiators critique favorable armistice terms. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, who had survived the initial assault on September 26th, commanded what remained of his battalion, roughly 40% of its original strength. The rest were casualties, evacuated to hospitals, or listed as missing. He had stopped learning the names of replacement soldiers who arrived to fill depleted ranks, knowing that many would be dead within days. The psychological toll of command was crushing, each decision potentially sending men to their deaths. The American supply system struggled to keep pace with the offensive's demands. Trucks and wagons bogged down on roads churned to mud by autumn rains and endless military traffic. Artillery units rationed shells, unable to provide the sustained bombardments that might have reduced casualties. Soldiers went days without hot food, subsisting on canned rations eaten cold in muddy trenches. Medical evacuation routes became so congested that wounded soldiers sometimes lay for hours before reaching aid stations. The influenza pandemic that was sweeping the world found fertile ground in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the front lines. Soldiers already weakened by combat, inadequate nutrition, and exposure began falling ill in vast numbers. Field hospitals filled with men dying from flu complications as well as battle wounds. Some units lost more men to disease than to German bullets. The combination of combat losses and illness reduced many divisions to mere shadows of their authorized strength. Back in the United States, the American public received carefully censored accounts of the fighting. Newspapers celebrated victories and highlighted heroes like Alvin York, while downplaying the staggering casualty figures. Gold Star flags began appearing in windows across the country, marking homes where sons had died in France. Mothers and fathers, wives and sweethearts, received telegrams beginning with, "We regret to inform you," each message carrying the weight of a destroyed world. The psychological casualties of the offensive, though less visible than physical wounds, would haunt survivors for decades. Soldiers who had experienced the hell of the Argonne Forest developed what was then called shell shock, what later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Men who had witnessed their friends torn apart by artillery or cut down by machine gun fire found themselves unable to escape those images. Some became violent, others withdrawn. The Army Medical Corps had neither the understanding nor the resources to treat these invisible wounds. By late October, the American offensive had finally broken through the main German defensive positions. The breakthrough came not through brilliant tactics or overwhelming force, but through sheer persistence and a willingness to absorb casualties that would have broken less determined forces. German units, exhausted and increasingly demoralized by the certainty of defeat, began withdrawing to secondary positions. The American advance accelerated, but even in retreat, the Germans exacted a terrible price. Private Richardson, now a corporal after surviving when so many others had died, led a small patrol into a captured German bunker on October 23rd. Inside, he found evidence of the enemy's humanity, photographs of sweethearts and families, letters from home, personal effects that differed little from those carried by American soldiers. The realization that the men they had been killing were people with loves and dreams, and fears identical to their own was somehow more disturbing than viewing them as faceless enemies. November 1st, 1918 began with an artillery barrage that demonstrated America's growing tactical sophistication. Instead of the prolonged bombardments that had characterized earlier phases of the offensive, American gunners fired brief, intense concentrations of shells, then shifted fire rapidly to support advancing infantry. The technique learned from their French allies proved devastatingly effective against increasingly disorganized German defenses. The first week of November saw American forces advancing rapidly across terrain that had cost thousands of lives to capture in previous weeks. German resistance, while still fierce in places, was crumbling. Units surrendered en masse, their soldiers exhausted, hungry, and increasingly aware that Germany's military situation was hopeless. The German government was engaged in armistice negotiations, though the soldiers dying in the trenches knew nothing of diplomatic discussions in distant capitals. Rumors of an impending armistice swept through both armies, creating a strange psychological dynamic. Soldiers on both sides became increasingly reluctant to take risks that might get them killed just days or hours before peace. Yet the fighting continued with undiminished intensity in many sectors. Officers determined to capture objectives before the war ended, or simply following orders that demanded continued pressure on the enemy, continued launching attacks. Men died winning positions that would be meaningless within days. Major Whittlesey, who had survived the Lost Battalion ordeal and been promoted and awarded the Medal of Honor, found the war's final days particularly bitter. He watched young soldiers dying for hills and villages that served no strategic purpose, sacrificed to satisfy command vanity or bureaucratic momentum. The weight of command and survivor guilt would eventually prove too much for Whittlesey. In 1921, during a sea voyage, he would disappear overboard in what was almost certainly suicide. On November 7th, a false armistice rumor swept through the American lines, triggering premature celebrations. Soldiers emerged from trenches, threw their helmets in the air, and embraced each other. German soldiers, hearing the commotion, ceased fire, creating a brief, surreal silence across the battlefield. Then, when no official confirmation arrived, both sides reluctantly returned to their positions and resumed killing each other, the false hope making the renewed violence even more bitter. The actual armistice was signed early on November 11th. With fighting scheduled to cease at 11 o'clock that morning, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. The decision to delay the ceasefire for 6 hours rather than implementing it immediately remains controversial. During those final hours, both sides continued fighting, and nearly 3,000 soldiers were killed or wounded after the armistice was signed, but before it took effect. General Pershing, determined to maintain pressure on the Germans until the final moment, ordered attacks to continue through the morning of November 11th. Some division commanders, recognizing the insanity of dying in the war's final hours, quietly allowed their troops to hunker down and wait. Others, either following orders rigidly or seeking last-minute glory, pushed their units into attacks that accomplished nothing except adding names to casualty lists. Private Henry Nicholas Gunther, a German-American soldier from Baltimore, was killed at 10:59, 1 minute before the armistice took effect. Gunther, who had been demoted for writing a letter home discouraging friends from joining the army, was apparently attempting to redeem himself through valor when he charged a German machine gun position that was trying to wave him away. The Germans, knowing the war was ending in moments, reluctantly fired, killing Gunther in what was likely the war's final American combat death. The senselessness of his death symbolized the war's ultimate futility. At precisely 11 o'clock on November 11th, an eerie silence descended across the Western Front. The artillery stopped firing, the machine guns went quiet, and soldiers on both sides slowly emerged from their trenches, unable to quite believe the war had ended. Some cheered, others wept. Many simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process survival after years of expecting death. Gott, Private Richardson, stood in a muddy field in France, alive when so many of his friends were dead, wondering how he would ever return to normal life. The final casualty figures for the Meuse-Argonne offensive painted a grim picture of America's bloodiest battle. From September 26 to November 11, 1918, the American Expeditionary Forces suffered approximately 120,000 casualties, including 26,000 killed in action. The 47-day offensive claimed more American lives than any other battle in United States history, before or since, exceeding even the costliest battles of World War II or the Vietnam War. The statistics, however, failed to capture the human reality behind the numbers. Each casualty represented a shattered family, a future unmade, a life of possibilities reduced to a name on a memorial. The town of Oak Ridge in Tennessee lost 17 young men in the offensive, nearly every family in the small community touched by grief. Similar stories played out in thousands of communities across America. The war's cost distributed unevenly, falling hardest on working-class families and recent immigrants. The wounded presented challenges that would burden the nation for decades. Approximately 70,000 Americans were wounded severely enough to require extended hospitalization or evacuation home. Many suffered injuries that would disable them for life. Amputated limbs, blinded eyes, damaged lungs from poison gas exposure, shattered spines. The Veterans Bureau, established to care for these men, was quickly overwhelmed by the scale of need. The psychological casualties, though uncounted in official statistics, may have exceeded physical wounds. Tens of thousands of soldiers returned home carrying invisible scars, nightmares, uncontrollable tremors, violent outbursts, crippling anxiety. The medical establishment of the era had limited understanding of psychological trauma. Many veterans suffering from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder were dismissed as weak or cowardly, their suffering compounded by social stigma. The African-American soldiers who served in the Meuse-Argonne offensive faced particular betrayal. Approximately 200,000 black soldiers served in France, with many fighting with distinction in combat units. The 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, served in combat for 191 days, longer than any other American unit. Despite their service and sacrifice, these veterans returned to a nation that continued to deny them basic civil rights and subjected them to racial violence and discrimination. The economic cost of the offensive, while dwarfed by the human toll, was nonetheless staggering. The United States spent approximately $32 billion on the war, equivalent to roughly $450 billion in contemporary currency. The Meuse-Argonne offensive consumed vast quantities of ammunition, equipment, and supplies. Artillery units fired over 4 million shells during the offensive. The logistical operation required to sustain 1 million soldiers in combat required ships, trucks, warehouses, and an army of support personnel. The French civilians who lived in the Argonne region paid their own terrible price. Their villages had been battlegrounds, their farms destroyed, their forests reduced to splintered stumps. Unexploded shells, mines, and other ordnance littered the countryside, making the land dangerous for decades afterward. Farmers plowing fields 50 years after the war still occasionally triggered explosions from buried munitions. The human cost of French civilians killed in the fighting, driven from their homes or dying from disease and starvation, was never fully calculated. Historical context provided by the U.S. Army Center of Military History indicates that American casualties in the Meuse-Argonne exceeded the combined American deaths in the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War. The concentrated nature of the losses, occurring over just 47 days, created a trauma felt throughout American society. The generation that came of age during the 1920s was shaped profoundly by the war's cost. Their cynicism about patriotic rhetoric and military glory rooted in knowledge of what had been paid in the Argonne Forest. December in 1918 brought the beginning of demobilization, as the vast American army in France began the process of returning home. For soldiers who had survived the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the wait was agonizing. They had endured combat expecting to die, survived when so many friends had not, and now faced delays returning to the lives they had dreamed about in the trenches. Makeshift camps near French ports held tens of thousands of soldiers waiting for ships, boredom and uncertainty replacing the terror of combat. The journey home was bittersweet for most veterans. They had survived, but survival brought its own burdens. Corporal Richardson sailed from Brest in January 1919 aboard a crowded transport ship. He spent the voyage mostly silent, avoiding the boisterous celebrations of soldiers excited to be going home. In quiet moments, he thought about the friends who would never make this journey, whose bodies lay in hastily dug graves scattered across France. The United States government faced the difficult task of handling its war dead. Families were given a choice: have their loved ones' remains returned to America for burial, or leave them in France in military cemeteries being established by the government. Approximately 46,000 families chose to have remains returned, while 30,000 were interred in American cemeteries in France. The Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery, located near Romain-Sous-Montfaucon, contains over 14,000 American war dead. The repatriation of remains became a massive logistical operation extending over several years. Bodies had to be located, identified when possible, exhumed from battlefield graves, and prepared for shipment. The Graves Registration Service employed thousands of soldiers in the grim task of recovering and identifying the dead. Many bodies were unidentifiable, their remains too damaged or decomposed. These unknown soldiers were buried with markers reading "known but to God," their families left without closure. Communities across America erected memorials to their war dead. Town squares received monuments listing local casualties. Eternal flames were lit, parks were dedicated to veterans. These memorials served important functions, providing focal points for communal grief and ensuring that the sacrifice would be remembered. Yet they also sanitized the war's reality, presenting noble sacrifice rather than the chaos, terror, and often pointless waste of young lives. Veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian society, and he found that people at home could not or would not understand what they had experienced. The gulf between those who had served in combat and those who had remained home created barriers that some veterans could never bridge. Some turned to alcohol to numb their memories, others isolated themselves, and a tragic number took their own lives. Unable to escape the war's psychological grip, the government's initial response to veterans' needs was inadequate. Medical care for the wounded was often poor, disability payments were insufficient, and promises of assistance rang hollow. This would lead to the Bonus Army March of 1932, when thousands of impoverished veterans descended on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of promised bonuses. The violent dispersal of these veterans by the Army, with tanks and tear gas, demonstrated that the nation's gratitude had limits. For some soldiers, the war's impact manifested in unexpected ways. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison returned to his law practice in Virginia, but found himself unable to focus on mundane legal matters after making life-and-death decisions daily for months. He eventually left law and became an advocate for veterans' rights, channeling his experience into efforts to improve the treatment of those who had served. His work helped establish better medical care and support systems for veterans. The influenza pandemic that had struck during the war's final months continued, devastating America into 1919. Many veterans who had survived German bullets died from influenza shortly after returning home, a bitter irony that compounded families' grief. The combined impact of war casualties and pandemic deaths created a demographic echo that affected American society for generations, a lost generation whose absence was felt in every aspect of national life. The 1920s witnessed America attempting to process the trauma of the Great War and the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The initial patriotic fervor gave way to disillusionment as the cost became clear, and the peace settlement proved disappointing. The Treaty of Versailles, rather than creating lasting peace, set conditions that would lead to another, even more destructive World War within 20 years. The American soldiers who died in the Argonne Forest had not, as promised, fought the war to end all wars. Private Richardson, who had been promoted to sergeant by war's end, returned to his Ohio hometown in March 1919. He found readjusting to civilian life nearly impossible. The mundane concerns of peacetime society seemed trivial compared to what he had experienced. He startled at loud noises, had nightmares that woke him screaming, and found himself unable to discuss the war with anyone who had not been there. Eventually, he found solace in connecting with other veterans, men who understood without needing words what they had endured. The literary and artistic legacy of the war, particularly works focusing on the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, shaped American culture for decades. Writers like John Dos Passos, E. Cummings, and Ernest Hemingway, who had served in various capacities during the war, produced works that captured the conflict's futility and horror. Their writing helped establish a cynical, anti-romantic view of warfare that contrasted sharply with the patriotic narratives of earlier American conflicts. The military lessons of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive were studied intensively by Army planners. The operation had revealed serious deficiencies in American military training, logistics, communications, and tactical doctrine. These lessons informed reforms during the interwar period, though whether those reforms adequately prepared the nation for World War II remains debatable. The tendency of military institutions to prepare for the last war rather than the next war was evident in planning that assumed future conflicts would resemble the static trench warfare of 1918. General Pershing emerged from the war as America's most celebrated military figure, promoted to General of the Armies, a rank held only by George Washington before him. Yet Pershing's insistence on American forces fighting under American command, while asserting national sovereignty, had contributed to the learning curve that cost thousands of lives. His determination to launch the Meuse-Argonne Offensive rather than allowing American divisions to reinforce Allied operations elsewhere was questioned by historians, though Pershing defended his decisions until his death in 19. The treatment of veterans gradually improved through the 1920s and 1930s, though never adequately addressing all needs. The establishment of the Veterans Administration in 1930 provided centralized oversight of veterans' benefits. Medical understanding of psychological trauma slowly advanced, though effective treatment for what we now call PTSD remained elusive. The nation learned, though imperfectly, that caring for those who serve extends beyond the moment they remove their uniform. The American cemeteries in France became pilgrimage sites for families seeking connection with lost loved ones. Thousands of mothers, fathers, wives, and siblings made the expensive and difficult journey to Europe to visit graves. The Gold Star Mothers Pilgrimages of the 1920s and early 1930s, funded by the government, brought over 6,000 mothers and widows to France. These women walked the battlefields where their sons and husbands had died, seeking understanding and closure that often proved elusive. The final cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive cannot be calculated in numbers alone. It includes the children never born to men who died in their youth, the contributions to society never made, the potential never realized. It includes families shattered by loss, women widowed in their 20s, children who grew up without fathers. It includes the psychological scars carried by survivors, the nightmares and flashbacks and emotional distance that affected relationships for decades after the guns fell silent. By the time World War II erupted in 1939, many veterans of the Great War watched with horror as their sons prepared to fight another European war. The promise that their sacrifice had ended war forever proved hollow. Some, like Corporal Richardson, actively discouraged their children from enlisting, trying to spare them the experiences that had haunted their own lives. Others, believing in duty and service, despite everything, supported their sons, while silently praying they would return intact in body and spirit. Today, more than a century after the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the battle's veterans have all passed away, taking their first-hand memories with them. What remains are the records, the memorials, the letters and diaries preserved by families, and the obligation of successive generations to remember. The sacrifice of those young men in the forests of France, regardless of whether we judge the war itself worthy of that sacrifice, deserves remembrance not as abstract patriotic symbol, but as the terrible human reality it was. The story of America's first major World War battle and the cost paid by young soldiers serves as both memorial and warning. It honors those who served and died while acknowledging the enormous price paid for limited gains. It recognizes courage and sacrifice while questioning the decisions that demanded such sacrifice. Most importantly, it remembers that war's cost is ultimately measured not in territory gained or enemies defeated, but in the broken bodies and scarred souls of those who must do the fighting, and in the grief of those who love them.